My name is Blanca Jacobs, 32 years old. At my engagement party, my parents handed me a gift. It was a video, the worst, most humiliating moments of my childhood, cut together and set to cheerful music so that a room full of people would laugh at them. They stood at the front of the room, my mother holding the little remote, my father with his arms crossed, and that grin he always wore right before the punchline. They pressed play. Then they turned to face everyone and waited for the laughter they had been given my entire life. I stood up. I smiled back at them. I said, "I have a gift for you two, too." They didn't know what I was holding. They didn't know it would wipe the smiles from their faces before the night was over, in front of the exact people they had spent months trying to impress. What I gave them next is the reason I can tell you this calmly now, without my voice shaking. But none of it makes sense until you understand what they did to me first, and how long they did it before anyone else was in the room to see. So let me take you back to the first time my father taught me that my pain was funny. I was 7. It was my birthday. There was a folding table set up in the backyard, paper plates, a sheet cake with my name spelled wrong in blue icing. My aunts were there, a couple of cousins, some neighbors. I remember I was wearing a yellow dress because my grandmother had told me yellow looked like sunshine on me, and I believed her, because she was the only person who ever said things like that. I pulled out my chair to sit down at the head of the table, and as I lowered myself into it, my father slid it away with his foot. I went straight down onto the concrete patio. The back of my head hit first, then my mouth caught the edge of the table on the way, and one of my front teeth chipped. I still have that tooth. I never fixed it. There's a small, rough corner on it, and for most of my life, whenever I got scared, I'd press my tongue against that chip without noticing I was doing it. I remember lying on the ground more than I remember the pain. I remember looking up at all those adult faces, and I remember the sound. Enough of them laughed that the few who looked uncomfortable disappeared inside it because my father was laughing, and when he laughed, the room followed. He laughed the loudest, wiped his eyes, pointed at me on the ground, and said, "You should have seen your face." My mother knelt down next to me. For 1 second I thought she was going to help me up. Instead, she brushed the hair out of my eyes, looked at my bleeding lip, and said the 4 words I would hear more times than I could ever count. "It's just a joke." Then she added the second part, the part that did the real damage. "Don't make it a thing. You're so sensitive." That was the whole system right there on my 7th birthday. The cruelty came first, then the label. Then everyone agreed the problem was me for feeling it. I want to be precise about something because it matters. My parents did not hit me. If you had asked anyone who knew them, they would have told you Dale and Sylvia Jacobs were fun. That was their word for themselves. Fun. Life of the party. The house was always full of noise and pranks and people, and I was the one thing in that house that could always be counted on to react. They hid my inhaler before a school field trip once, then returned it at the door while I was panicking, laughing because they had made me believe I would have to leave without it. They took a science project I'd worked on for 3 weeks and rewired it to fall apart when I plugged it in at the fair, in front of the judges, and filmed my face when it did. They'd wake me at 2 in the morning by standing over my bed in a mask just to watch me scream and then tell the story at dinner for a week. Every single time when I cried, when I got angry, when I asked them to stop, the answer was the same. Just a joke. Too sensitive. Can't take it. The science project is the one I still think about because it was when I understood they were not careless. They were deliberate. I was 14. I'd built a small motor from a kit, and I'd wired it myself, and I'd checked it 3 times because it mattered to me, and I almost never let anything matter to me where they could see. On the morning of the fair, My father offered to carry it to the car. I let him, because for 1 hour I wanted to believe he was proud. At the fair, in front of 2 judges with clipboards, I plugged it in, and it sparked and died. One of the judges gave me a look I can still feel. That night, my father laughed and told me he'd loosened a wire, just to keep me humble, and my mother said I should be able to take a joke, and I went to my room and understood that the offer to carry it had been part of it. He'd needed it in his hands to do it. The kindness was the setup. After that, I stopped letting them carry anything of mine, literally and every other way. And here's the thing about being told you're too sensitive year after year. Eventually, you stop trusting your own reactions. You feel the hurt land, and then a second voice in your head says, maybe it's you. Maybe you really are broken. Maybe everyone else can take it, and you can't. By the time I was a teenager, I couldn't tell the difference anymore between something that was genuinely funny and something that was hurting me. I'd wait to see if people laughed. If they laughed, I decided I was wrong to be upset. There was exactly one person who never did that to me. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Ruth Delaney. Everyone called her Nana Ruth. She lived across town in a small house that smelled like coffee and cedar. And when I stayed with her, nobody pulled my chair. Nobody hid my things. Nobody stood over my bed. She had a way of looking at me when I talked, like what I was saying was worth hearing all the way to the end. Once, after a bad weekend, I told her that Dad said I couldn't take a joke. She put down her cup and looked at me and said, "Sweetheart, you take a joke fine. What you can't take is being hurt on purpose. Nobody should be able to take that." I was 9 when she said that. I didn't understand it yet, but I never forgot it. She died when I was 10. Fast, in the winter of 2003. A stroke, and then a week in a hospital, and then nothing. I wasn't allowed to see her at the end. At the funeral, my father made a joke during the reception about the casket, and my mother laughed, and I went and sat in the car by myself. After Nana Ruth died, my mother let me take 1 box of her things, a shoebox. In it were her reading glasses, a few photographs, a church program, and a small handheld tape recorder, the kind she used to leave herself reminders on. There was 1 cassette still inside it. My mother said, "She probably just recorded her grocery list. Don't get worked up." I put the box on the top shelf of my closet. I told myself I would listen to the tape when I was ready. I was 10, and I was afraid that if I heard her voice, I would lose the last piece of her I had left. I would not press play on that tape for 22 years. Losing her took the last safe place I had. My parents now had the house, and me, inside it, entirely to themselves. The jokes didn't stop. They got bigger, because there was no one left to say, "That's enough." The one that ended my childhood came when I was 18. I had gotten into a state university about 2 hours away. I had a partial scholarship, enough to cover most of it, and I had saved the rest myself, working weekends at a grocery store since I was 15. $6,200 in a savings account I opened at 16, with my mother, listed jointly because I was still a minor. That money was going to move me out of that house. It was the most important thing I owned. There was a deadline to confirm my spot and pay the balance. Early August. I had the acceptance paperwork, payment instructions, account information, and identification copies in one folder. 2 days before the deadline, the folder was gone from my room. So was my debit card, all of it. I asked my parents. My father said he didn't know what I was talking about. My mother told me I was being paranoid, that I'd probably misplaced it, that I was so scattered. I tore my room apart. With my card, account information, and payment instructions gone, the bank could not restore my access in time, and the university could not reconstruct my payment file before the deadline. Friday came and went. My spot went to someone on the wait list. That Sunday at dinner, my father slid the folder across the table to me. My account statement was on top. The money was still there. Every dollar. He had simply held the folder and my card until the deadline passed. He watched me realize it. He watched it move across my face. And then he laughed, and my mother laughed with him. And he said, "Relax. We were always going to give it back. You should have seen yourself all week. It was a joke." I didn't yell. I want you to understand that I had, by 18, been trained out of yelling. Yelling proved I was too sensitive. Yelling proved them right. So I looked at the $6,200 that were still mine and the acceptance papers for a school I could no longer attend, and I understood something I had been refusing to understand for 11 years. It was never a joke. It was a choice. They chose it, over and over, and they liked it. That was the last dinner I ever ate in that house. I left 3 weeks later with 2 duffel bags and that shoebox. I did not have a plan. I had a little over $6,000 and no idea how to be a person because I'd spent my whole life bracing for the next thing instead of learning how to live. The next few years were not dramatic, and I am not going to pretend they were. They were gray. I moved to a city where I didn't know anyone. I took jobs that didn't require me to trust people. I stocked shelves at night. I cleaned offices. I was good at being invisible because I'd had a lot of practice. The anxiety I'd carried my whole life had room to grow now, and it grew. I flinched when people moved too fast near me. I couldn't sit with my back to a door. I'd have a good day and then wait all day for someone to pull the chair, and when no one did, I didn't feel relief. I felt like I was missing something. That's what they did to me. They made safety feel like a setup. There was a stretch, around 21 or 22, when I mostly stopped. I stopped calling anyone back. I stopped opening mail. It stacked on the counter until the pile fell over, and I stepped around it for a week. I lost a cleaning job because I couldn't make myself get out of the car in the mornings, and I'd sit in the parking lot until the shift was over and then drive home and tell no one, because there was no one. Stopped, in a lot of ways, being a person who wanted things, because wanting things had never once been safe. I'd learned that, in a house where the fastest way to lose something was to let them see you loved it. I'm not going to describe that stretch in more detail than that, except to say it was the closest I ever came to disappearing entirely, and that the reason I didn't wasn't some big moment. Nobody rescued me. There was no phone call, no letter, no sign from anywhere. It was just that some mornings I got up anyway, for no reason I could name. And one of those mornings I got up and went for a walk because the walls were too close. And I saw a hand-lettered sign in the window of a place called Larkspur Greenhouse and Nursery. Help wanted. The letters were uneven, like someone had written them by hand and not cared that they were uneven. And something about that made me stop. I almost didn't go in. I went in. The woman who owned it was named Denise Halloran. She was maybe 60, with dirt under her nails and reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. She asked me 3 questions and then had me repot a tray of seedlings while she watched to see if I was gentle with them. I was. She hired me that afternoon for part-time work, $180 a week to start. On my second day, I knocked over a rack of terracotta pots. A dozen of them shattered on the concrete floor, this huge crash, and I froze. I actually put my hands up over my head. I waited for it, the laughing, the "you should have seen your face," the label. Denise came around the corner, looked at the mess, looked at me standing there with my arms up, and just said, "Concrete floors brutal on those. My fault. I stacked them too high." She handed me a broom. "You okay? You look like you're waiting to get yelled at." I said I was fine. She looked at me a second longer and said, "For what it's worth, that was a normal reaction to a loud noise. You don't have to apologize for it. I want to tell you I held it together. I didn't. I went into the back and cried into a bag of potting soil for 10 minutes because a stranger had just described my reaction as normal instead of as a flaw. Then I came back out and swept up the pots. That was 2016, the year the ground finally stopped sliding. I worked at Larkspur for years, and slowly something happened that I hadn't expected. I was good at it. I had a feel for it. Plants that other people gave up on, I could bring back. Denise started letting me handle the sick ones, the root rot, the shock cases, the ones customers brought back half dead. She'd say, "Give it to Blanca, she talks them into it." And they'd come back. Not all of them, but enough that I started to understand something I'd never once felt in that house. Some things grow when you finally stop hurting them. There was a maple, a little Japanese maple in a pot, that a woman brought in one October so far gone that Denise told her to just compost it. The woman had gotten it as a wedding gift and her husband had died, and she couldn't stand to lose the tree too. I asked if I could try. It took me 4 months. I cut it back hard. I changed its soil. I moved it 3 times to find the light it wanted, and in the spring it put out new red leaves. And when the woman came to get it, she sat down on an overturned bucket and cried, and I stood there not knowing what to do with being the reason someone was crying in a good way. Word got around after that. People started bringing me plants other places had given up on. Denise increased my hours, raised my pay to $240 a week, and started calling me the closer. As my hours became steadier, I got my own apartment. A real 1-bedroom with a door that locked and no one on the other side who thought scaring me was entertainment. The first night I slept there, I left every light on and lay awake anyway. But the second night, I turned one off. It took me a month to turn them all off. That was progress. I measured everything in progress that small. I opened a second savings account too, and I put money in it every week, even when it was $20, even when $20 hurt. I never let it drop. Not because I had a plan for it, but because once, a long time ago, I'd had $6,200 that was supposed to buy me a way out, and someone had reached into my life and taken it just to watch my face. I promised myself I would always have a door I could walk through that no one else held the key to. By the time I was 30, that account held a few $1,000s. I rarely touched it, and just knowing it was there changed how I stood in a room. It's hard to explain what it does to a person to finally own the exit. My parents did not disappear from my life. That's not how these people work. They'd surface every few months, always when they needed something. My father called once to ask if I could co-sign something. My mother called to tell me a cousin was getting married, and to ask, in the same breath, whether I'd gotten over my little dramatic phase. When I sent a photo of the apartment, proud of it, she wrote back one line. Cute, small. That was it. They had a talent for reaching into a good moment and leaving one cold fingerprint on it. The worst one came the day I told them about the maple, about the woman crying, because some part of me was still at 28, holding a small offering up to see if this would be the thing that made them proud. My father listened to the whole story on speakerphone and then said, "So you're a plant babysitter." My mother laughed. In the background, I heard him say to her, not even bothering to move away from the phone, she saved $6,000 for college, and now she's watering ferns. I hung up, and for 3 days, even touching a plant felt wrong, which for me was like not eating. I called it a bad week. Dr. Mercer later called it what it was. She said, "They found the one thing that was finally yours, and they reached in and left a fingerprint on it. That isn't a coincidence. That's the pattern." That was the first time I understood the cruelty wasn't random. It was targeted, and the target was always whatever I loved. 2 years before that call, in 2019, I had done the thing I'd been avoiding for a decade. I found a therapist. Her name was Dr. Catherine Mercer, and I almost quit after the first session because talking about my family out loud made it sound either insane or trivial, and I couldn't tell which, and that not being able to tell was exactly the wound. Dr. Mercer gave me a word for it. She said, "What you're describing is a pattern where someone hurts you and then rewrites the event so that your reaction becomes the problem. Over time, you lose access to your own read of reality. That's not you being sensitive. That's the mechanism working exactly as designed." I remember sitting in that chair in my mid-20s and feeling the floor of my whole life tilt. Because if that was true, then the second voice in my head, the one that always said maybe it's you, wasn't my conscience. It was theirs. They had planted it. I'd been carrying their voice around for years and calling it self-awareness. I started setting boundaries, small ones. The first real one was over the phone. My mother called to guilt me about missing a family gathering, and she said, "You've always been the difficult one." Instead of defending myself for an hour like I always had, I said, "I'm going to hang up now," and I did. Then I sat on my kitchen floor, shaking for 20 minutes because I was sure the sky was going to fall. It didn't. They had taught me that a boundary was a bomb. It wasn't. It was just a door. It wasn't a straight line up. There were bad stretches. A single unexpected voicemail from my father, doing one of his funny voices, could put me back in bed for 2 days. Dr. Mercer said that was a trauma response, not proof that I was weak. She had a way of making my worst reactions sound like sane responses to real things, and every time she did, a little more of the label peeled off me. She asked me once to try an exercise. She said, "Next time you feel the second voice, the one that says, 'Maybe it's you,' don't argue with it. Just ask it a question. Whose voice is this really?" So I did. The next time my mother left a message that curled up cold in my chest, I sat with it and asked whose voice was telling me I'd overreacted. And the answer came back so fast it scared me. It was my mother's voice. It had always been my mother's voice, wearing my own like a coat. I'd been doing their job for them for years, for free, in my own head, every day. When I told Dr. Mercer that, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Now you can start giving it back to them." I didn't fully understand what she meant yet. I would eventually, in a room full of people, with a tape. Then, in 2022, I met Nate. He came into Larkspur on a Tuesday looking for something that could survive a north-facing window because, he said, he'd already killed 3 plants and was starting to take it personally. He was a furniture maker. He built chairs, tables, and cabinets in a shop across town. His hands were rough and careful at the same time. He asked good questions and listened to the whole answer, and something about the way he listened reminded me, painfully, of my grandmother. I didn't trust it. For months, I kept waiting for the catch. The moment he'd use something I'd told him against me, turn a soft thing into a joke. I tested him without meaning to. Once, early on, I told him something small and embarrassing, a fear I had, and I watched his face the way you watch a road for ice, waiting for the moment he'd file it away to use later. Weeks passed. He never brought it up, never turned it into a bit, never held it over me even lightly. When I finally asked him, straight out, why he hadn't laughed at it, he looked confused and said, "Why would I laugh at something that scares you?" It was such a simple sentence. It undid something in me that 100 sophisticated things never could have. He wasn't performing kindness. He was just kind, in an ordinary, durable way. The way some people just are and you never had access to. The thing that changed everything happened in mid-2023, about a year after we met, at a dinner my parents had insisted on hosting. I should have known better. Halfway through, my father slipped Nate's car keys off the counter and hid them, then spent 20 minutes letting Nate search while he watched and waited for the reveal, for the payoff. My mother kept glancing at me to see if I was enjoying it, the way you'd check whether a child was enjoying a magic trick. When my father finally produced the keys with a big ta-da, expecting Nate to laugh, Nate didn't laugh. He took his keys back, looked at my father, and said evenly, "That wasn't funny. Why would you do that?" The table went quiet. My father did the recovery I'd seen 1,000 times. "Come on, it's a joke. She never told you we're jokers?" And he looked at me, waiting for me to smooth it over, to translate for him, to tell Nate to lighten up. That was my job at that table. I'd done it my whole life. I didn't do it. I just watched Nate not laugh. And I realized I had never, not once, seen an outside adult refuse the joke. I'd started to believe it wasn't possible, that everyone, deep down, agreed with my parents, and I was the only holdout. In the car afterward, Nate said, "Has it always been like that?" And I said yes, and he said, "That wasn't a joke, Blanca. I want to be clear with you that I saw it, and it wasn't a joke." I cried in the passenger seat, and it was a different kind of crying than the potting soil. It was the crying you do when a thing you've been carrying alone gets picked up by someone else for the first time. We got engaged in the fall of 2025. He didn't make it a spectacle. He asked me in the greenhouse on a slow gray afternoon among the ferns, and I said yes. Denise, who had somehow known, came out from the back with 2 paper cups and a bottle she'd been hiding. That was the celebration, the 3 of us, and it was perfect. Here is where my parents come back into the story, and I need you to notice why they came back, because it's the whole thing. They didn't come back because they missed me. They came back because of the Brennans. Nate's family were, by any measure, respectable and warm. His mother, Helen, ran a nonprofit. His father, Gordon, was a retired school principal, the kind of man an entire town seems to know and like. When Nate's parents heard we were engaged, they wanted to throw us a party, and they wanted to meet my family, and they were genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy for us. And my parents sensed it. They saw a room full of respectable people who did not know them yet, a fresh audience. Over the years, the people who had known Dale and Sylvia Jacobs longest had quietly stopped inviting them to things. Relatives thinned out, old friends drifted. That is what eventually happens when the fun always has a target. Nobody makes an announcement. The phone simply rings less. My parents had spent years slowly running out of rooms. The Brennans were a brand new room, and my engagement was the ticket in. My mother called me, warmer than she had been in years. She wanted to be involved in the party and give a toast. She said, and I remember the exact phrasing, "Let us do something special for you, honey. We owe you a good day." I had not heard that tone from her since before Nana Ruth died. It should have felt good. Instead, it made the back of my neck cold, because I knew that tone was for the Brennans, not for me. I saw the proof of it at a lunch a few weeks before the party, when both families met for the first time. My parents were charming. That's the word everyone used afterward, charming. My father told stories that made Gordon laugh. My mother complimented Helen's work like she'd followed the nonprofit for years. They were warm and funny and gracious, and they touched my shoulder when they talked about me. And Helen leaned over to me at one point and said kindly, "Your parents are lovely." I said thank you. I watched my father across the table performing the exact warmth he'd never once spent on me in private, spending it freely now that it could buy him something. And I understood that to them, I had never been a daughter. I'd been a cost, and now, finally, I was an asset, a bridge into a room they wanted, and they were willing to be lovely for as long as the bridge held. I said I'd think about it. That's when a lot of things started moving at once. I'd been in therapy with Dr. Mercer for nearly 6 years by then, and we had circled my grandmother many times. But that November, She asked me a question she had never asked before. In your whole childhood, was there anyone who saw you clearly? Even one person? I said, my grandmother. She asked what had happened to her, and I told her. Then I mentioned, almost as an aside, the tape I had never played, the one that had moved with me to every apartment for 22 years, still inside that shoebox. Dr. Mercer got very still. She said, "You've been carrying a recording of the one person who believed you for 22 years, and you've never listened to it." She let that sit. Then she said, "You don't have to. But I think you already know what's on it, and I think that's why you've never been able to." I went home. I got the shoebox down. My hands were not steady. I put the tape into the little recorder, and I sat on the floor of my apartment, 32 years old, and I pressed play. Her voice came out of that speaker like no time had passed at all. It wasn't a grocery list. She had made it for me. She said my name at the start, Blanca. She said she was recording it because she had been feeling unwell and there were things she needed me to have, in case she was not around. Then she said the thing I had feared and needed my entire life, in a voice that was calm and certain, and a little angry, not at me, but for me. She said, "Blanca, you are not too sensitive. I need you to hear me say it, because they are going to spend your whole childhood telling you that you are, and they are wrong. What they do to you is not a joke, and it is not love. I have watched it. I have told your mother to stop, and she will not stop, because your father won't, and she has decided he matters more than you do. That is not your fault. None of it was ever your fault. You are not the broken one in that house, sweetheart. You are the only one who's still working right." And then, quieter, "Trust yourself. When you're grown and you're finally away from them and something in you says, 'This is wrong, this hurts,' believe that voice. That voice is me. I'll be in there." I sat on that floor for a long time. As I listened, I understood why I had never been able to play it. Some part of me had always known. I understood something else too, colder and clearer. Everyone in that family had respected Nana Ruth. My father used to defer to her. My mother still teared up at the mention of her. She was the one adult whose judgment neither of them had ever mocked. And she had said, on tape, in her own voice, that it was never a joke. That my mother knew and chose my father anyway. I wasn't holding a memory anymore. I was holding the one witness they could never call a liar. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had, for the first time in my life, a card. And I sat with it, and I thought about the party, and I thought about my mother's voice saying, "We owe you a good day," and I made myself a single quiet promise. If they tried to make me the joke one more time in front of those good people, I was not going to defend myself. I was done defending myself. I was going to let the truth walk into the room on its own 2 feet. I told my mother yes, they could be part of the party. They could give a toast. I said it evenly, and I meant it. And when I hung up, I felt something I'd never felt around them before, which was steady. Over the next couple of weeks, my parents became strangely enthusiastic. Too enthusiastic. My mother asked twice whether the Brennans would all be there, how many people were coming, and whether Gordon's former colleagues had been invited. She was counting the room. My father asked whether the venue had a screen and projector. When I asked why, he said, "We might put together something nice. A little tribute. You'll see." A little tribute. I felt the old cold move down my arms, but I said, "That sounds nice," and I let it go, because I'd already decided I wasn't going to fight them before the party. I was going to let them show everyone exactly who they were. Then my cousin Wendy called me. Wendy is a few years younger than me, one of the only relatives who ever quietly checked on me over the years. She'd been at my parents' house helping my mother with something, and she'd seen my father at the computer. and she'd seen what was on the screen. She didn't want to be the one to tell me, but she couldn't not tell me. The tribute video was not a tribute. It was a compilation of humiliating home video moments they had recorded throughout my childhood, cut together with cartoon sound effects and comedy music. Wendy's voice broke when she reached the part that had made her call. "Blanca, they put Nana Ruth in it. There's a clip from her funeral. They used it as a punchline." I didn't say anything for a moment. Wendy thought the call had dropped. I was very calm. That surprised me. I'd expected to shatter. Instead, I felt the whole shape of my life click into place, like the last plant sliding into the last empty spot on a shelf. They were going to stand up in front of the Brennans, in front of Gordon and Helen and everyone whose respect they wanted, and they were going to play my worst moments for laughs, and they were going to use my dead grandmother, the one person who ever loved me, as the biggest joke of all. I said, "Thank you, Wendy. Don't tell them you told me, and please, whatever happens at the party, just stay in your seat." I hung up, and I sat with it. I could have canceled the toast. I could have called my parents and told them I knew and had the fight in private, where they had controlled the story for 25 years. That's what the old me would have done, the one who spent her whole life trying to manage them quietly so no one else would ever have to see. But I'd learned something at Larkspur that turned out to apply to more than plants. You can't fix a thing in the dark. You have to bring it into the light where you can actually see what's wrong with it. So I did not cancel anything. I used a cassette player to transfer Nana Ruth's recording onto my phone, then confirmed with the venue that I would be able to connect it to the sound system when the time came. I did not cry. My hands stayed steady. I finally understood the difference between the calm they had forced on me, the calm of a child bracing to be hurt, and the calm I felt now, the calm of a grown woman who had decided exactly what she was going to do. They had a tape of my humiliation. I had a tape, too. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep, so I sat up in the dark with the shoebox open on my lap. I took out Nana Ruth's reading glasses and held them. I thought about the yellow dress and the concrete patio and the corner of my tooth. Somewhere in the last 25 years, I'd been that little girl on the ground, looking up at a ring of laughing faces, deciding it must be her fault. I pressed my tongue against the chip in my tooth, the old reflex, the tell. Then I stopped. I made myself stop. Nate came out and sat with me. I had not told him every detail, but I had told him enough. I said my parents had made a cruel video and that I intended to handle it myself. Whatever happened, I needed him beside me, not rescuing me. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Okay, but I'm going to stand where you can see me." He held my hand in the dark. As a gift, he had built the venue's long walnut head table and its chairs himself, solid and heavy, with joints tight enough to outlast all of us. I looked at those chairs and I thought, tomorrow, no one is going to pull my chair out from under me. Not ever again. I'm the one who decides now. The party was in December of 2025. About 60 people. The Brennans had done it beautifully. String lights and warm food, and a room that actually felt like celebration, which was a foreign feeling to me. For the first hour, I was the center of something kind, and I kept waiting for the trapdoor. And then I remembered I was the one who knew where the trapdoor was tonight. After dinner, my father stood up and tapped his glass, and my mother rose beside him with the little remote in her hand, and my father said, in his big, warm room-owning voice, "Before things wrap up, Sylvia and I put together a little something for our daughter, a trip down memory lane." The lights dimmed. The screen came alive. And there it was, me, 6 years old, crying at a birthday because they'd popped a balloon in my face. Cartoon spring sound effect. Me at 9, screaming in my bed at the masked figure over me, and my father's laugh on the audio track. A slide whistle. Me at 18, the exact moment my face fell when I understood about the tuition money, because they'd filmed even that, they'd filmed it, set now to a sad trombone. I watched the room. This was what they had never understood. They had only performed for people already trained to follow my father's laughter. They did not know what to do with a room that had never agreed to laugh. Nobody laughed. Gordon Brennan's face had gone stony. Helen had her hand over her mouth. A woman near the front looked physically ill. The comedy music kept playing into a silence that got heavier with every second, and my parents, facing the screen, didn't feel it yet. Then the funeral clip came up. My grandmother's casket, my 10-year-old self standing beside it, a record scratch sound effect, and a cartoon wah-wah, and my father's voice, recorded that day, saying the joke he'd made at the reception. Somebody in the back said, "Oh my God," out loud. My parents finally turned around to collect their laughter, and they found the silence instead. 60 people, motionless, staring at them. My father's grin flickered. My mother's hand with the remote drifted down to her side. And my father, because he had exactly one tool and had used it his whole life, reached for it one more time. He spread his hands and said to the whole silent room, "Oh, come on, it's a joke. Why is everyone being so serious?" And there it was, out loud, in a room full of people who could finally see it for what it was. The 4 words, the magic trick, performed in the light, where the wires showed. I stood up. I did not rush. I felt every eye come to me. I did not press my tongue to my tooth. I looked at my parents, then at the room, and took out my phone. I said, "My parents are right about one thing. They did bring a gift tonight. So did I." I connected my phone to the venue's sound system, as I had arranged before the party, and pressed play. And my grandmother's voice, calm and certain, and 22 years gone, filled that silent room. "Blanca, you are not too sensitive. What they do to you is not a joke, and it is not love. I have watched it. I have told your mother to stop, and she will not stop because your father won't, and she has decided he matters more than you do. That is not your fault. You are not the broken one in that house, sweetheart. You are the only one who's still working right." I watched my mother's knees give a little. She caught the edge of the table. My father had gone a color I'd never seen on him. Because they could dismiss me. They had built their whole lives on dismissing me, but they could not dismiss her. Dale and Sylvia had never been able to call Ruth Delaney a liar, too sensitive or dramatic. She was the one voice in the family that both of them, including my father, had always respected. And she had just told the whole room in her own unmistakable voice that it was never a joke, that my mother knew and chose anyway. I watched it land on the room, too. Gordon Brennan had risen halfway out of his chair without seeming to know he'd done it. Helen was crying openly now, and she was not the only one. Wendy had both hands pressed to her mouth, and I saw, on face after face, the exact thing my parents had spent a lifetime preventing from happening in one room. Understanding. All of them, at once, understood what they had just been shown, and what it must have been like to grow up inside it. When the recording ended, I let the silence sit for a moment. I'd learned, finally, how to let a silence work for me instead of against me. Then I said quietly, "So they had to stay quiet to hear me." That was the truth, and I didn't need to say a word of it myself. She said it in 2003. You heard it in 2025. I looked at my father. You called it a joke for 25 years, but a joke needs a room that laughs. Look around. He looked around. For the first time in his life, my father looked around a room and found no laughter waiting for him. Not from the Brennans, not from the cousins, not from the neighbors. My mother had let go of the table and covered her face with both hands. He had spent his whole life needing an audience, and I had finally let him have a real one, an audience he could not control. I took my grandmother's little recorder from my bag, held it for a second, then put it away. I took Nate's hand. He had stayed exactly where I could see him the whole time, and he had let me do it myself. I said, "I'm not going to make a scene. You already did that." Then I walked out of the room and out of the party, and I did not look back to see their faces because I no longer needed to. They followed me out. Of course they did. The audience was gone and they wanted it back. In the hallway outside, my father tried volume first. "You humiliated us in there, in front of those people, everything we've done for you." I stopped and turned around, and something in my face made him stop. My mother was crying, real crying, or what looked like it. She reached for my arm. "Blanca, honey, we didn't..." It got away from us. It was supposed to be light. You know how your father is. It was one bad idea, one mistake. "No," I said, keeping my voice level because I wanted her to hear every word. "A mistake happens once. You made the same choice for 25 years. You don't get to shrink 25 years into one bad night now that a room finally saw it." She stopped reaching. Then she said the thing I had waited my whole life to hear, and it did not heal anything. I think she knew it would not even as she said it. "I knew." Her voice cracked. "I did. I knew it went too far a long time ago. But when your father is happy, the whole house is easier, and it was easier to stay on his side. I told myself you were tougher than you looked. I told myself that so I would not have to admit what I was doing." She looked down. I knew. There it was. Not oblivious. Complicit. She had heard my grandmother tell her to stop 22 years earlier, and she had kept weighing her daughter against her husband's good mood. She had chosen the good mood again and again, then called me sensitive so she would not have to feel the weight of that choice. I had thought hearing her admit it would feel like winning. It did not. It felt like the floor dropping one more inch. A small, 10-year-old part of me had held out hope all those years that she simply had not understood. Now I knew she had. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I said. "It's about 25 years late." I looked at both of them. "I used to wait for you to stop. I spent my whole childhood waiting for you to stop. Tonight I stopped waiting." My father started another version of the same defense, and I did not let him finish. "This is the last one. There will not be another joke, because I will not be in the room for it. Don't call Nate. Don't call the Brennans. Don't send anyone to explain. We're done." And then I walked out into the December cold, and Nate put his coat around my shoulders, and we went home. That was a few months ago now. I want to tell you the end is not loud because it is not. The end is quiet, and I have learned that chosen quiet is the opposite of the frightened silence they raised me in. I'm still at Larkspur. Denise made me a partner last year, which mostly means I handle the ordering and worry about the heating bills, but my name is on the sign now beside hers. I spend my days bringing half-dead things back, and I have stopped pretending I do not understand why that work means so much to me. There's a new weekend worker, 17, jumpy, apologizing for everything and flinching whenever a rack tips. Last week he knocked over a tray of seedlings and stood there with his shoulders up around his ears, waiting to be yelled at. I know that posture. I lived in it. I handed him a broom and told him it was a normal reaction to a loud noise and that he did not have to apologize. He looked at me the way I once looked at Denise. Some things you get to pass on. Nate and I are getting married in the spring. He finished the last chair for our kitchen table a few days ago, sanded and oiled it, then set it at the head where I sit. It is heavy and solid. The joints are so tight the chair will not shift beneath me. He did not explain it when he put it there, and neither did I. But we both knew what it meant. Nobody is ever going to pull that chair out from under me again. And if anyone tries, I will decide what happens next. We eat dinner at that table most nights, just the two of us, sometimes Denise, sometimes the new kid when he doesn't want to go home yet. It's a loud table, but it's the good kind of loud, the kind where the laughing never has a target, where nobody's watching your face to see if it's working. I didn't know a table could be that until I was 32 years old. I sat at one, my whole childhood bracing for the floor. Now I sit at one that Nate built to hold, and I've stopped bracing. And it took me most of my life to learn that the bracing was never mine to begin with. My parents sent a letter. It is on the counter. It is an apology, or at least the shape of one. I read it at once, and I have not decided what to do with it. I have made peace with not deciding yet. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, will happen on my schedule, not theirs. It is not a door they get to knock on. Dr. Mercer says that is not bitterness. She says it is the boundary holding. She is right. Nana Ruth's recorder is on a shelf in our living room beside a fern I grew from a cutting nobody thought would take. I do not need to play the tape anymore. I know what it says. Somewhere underneath my parents' voices, I think I always knew. Now their voices are finally quiet enough for hers to be the one I hear. You are not the broken one. You are the only one still working right. I survived them. I rebuilt myself slowly from the things they tried to discard, and I do not need them to tell me I am worth anything anymore. A woman who loved me told me the truth 22 years ago, and I finally believed her. The joke ended the moment I decided it would. That was always the one choice they could never make for me. If you grew up being told your pain was a punchline, hear me, the way I finally heard her. You were never too sensitive. The people who taught you to doubt yourself don't get to hold the pen anymore. And if you're out here quietly rebuilding a whole life out of what your family threw away, I'd want to know about it. What's the thing they told you was your fault that you've since learned was never yours to carry? I'll be reading.